this is where it really starts to get interesting historically, in my opinion. I like the Sumerians, and if you weren't here, I've got a few of those copies left over in the back corner over here that you can grab. But the Sumerians are interesting because they kind of are foundational to a lot of stuff. But when we get to Babylon, we get to heavy interaction with Scripture. If you look in your notes as we go through, you'll notice I gave some of those scriptures, not all of them, but some of those scriptures where we see Babylon interacting with it. Babylon is to be noticed, and it's notable during the Old Testament because of two reasons. They were God's instrument of destruction against Jerusalem. Remember, whenever Jerusalem, and actually whenever they just stopped listening to God, what did God do? He sent them off into exile multiple times. One of those times we see Daniel being taken captive, and that's whenever he's taken to Babylon and the destruction against Jerusalem. And we'll get to that in a few moments. They transmitted and in some cases originated most of the cultural and religious foundations in the Old Testament world. So those cultural and religious things that went on that we see God condemning and God doing all this other discussion on, we see it originating in Babylon. In some ways it originated in Sumeria because we see the Babylonians are going to pick up some of their stuff and run with it and make it their own. But we do see it begin early on, and we have more records of it in the Babylonian era. On this map here, this kind of gives you an idea of where the Babylonian Empire is. You have Egypt here, you have Babylon, and now this is the height of the Babylonian Empire, if you will. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. You have the Medes or the Medo-Persian Empire. Whenever you include this area over here is what it would be called. And, just so you know, we moved to this not too far away from now, but we're talking here about the Mesopotamian area first in our studies. So most of the cities in Babylon were located on the Euphrates River or one of its canals, and we saw that Sumer and Ur and those areas were located in the same place. And so whenever you see those, which you can't really see on this map, but they kind of go up this line here, but you see a lot of those cities originating in that era. By the way, this map right here, I don't know if you can see this bottom left corner, ebibleteacher.com. I got this off a Google search, but I actually know the guy who created this website, and if he still runs the website, it's a very, very good website for maps and pictures and all kinds of stuff. It's ebibleteacher.com. It was great when I was a youth intern. I interned at the church of the guy who created that website, and it's just outstanding. I used to go and check in on it over and over, and now that Google's gotten so large, Google has the same stuff. But if you don't want to have to cipher through all the Google stuff and you just want straight Bible, you can go to that website for maps and so forth. So we see that these significant cities are on the banks of the Euphrates, or it goes off on one of the canals. And if you were to look at a map, it has little canals going each and every way for irrigation purposes. During the Iron Age, and scholars say it's around 1200, and as you know, when you start dating everything in the Old Testament, it gets iffy, so I don't stick to dates real well, except for the dates that are written in stone or in clay, and we'll see that in a few moments. But during the Iron Age, the Babylon started to struggle as they were having their enemies, the Elamites. They were coming and warring against them. And during this time, so there's this era, I'm going to give you this information, and we're going to back up a moment and then come back to this information. During this era, we see two major powers begin to slowly collapse. That would be the Egyptians and the Hittites. We see those empires slowly starting on a decline, and more rapidly than Babylon, if you will. And Babylon's kind of in its own little sector, so it's not quite as impacted by all this stuff going on, all the wars taking place. But as those two begin to deteriorate, Babylon will start to deteriorate as well. And so all of this is deteriorating, but if you continue on in history, Babylon starts falling and falling and falling, and more wars are taking place. People are coming into their borders. And keep in mind, this is long before Daniel. How many of you were aware that Babylon had a point where it started going back into a recession before it got its empire back? Anyone know that about Babylon? We learned one thing tonight. Yes! All right, great class, guys. I'll see you next week. Babylon, this is something I didn't realize. I thought Babylon was this strong power, and it never lost its power. But under certain kings, and I can't pronounce their names, so I just left them off your sheets and my sheet. Under the set of kings, it's like the second and third dynasty, I believe, of kings. Babylon started to deteriorate following the Egyptians and the Hittites. And the borders that it once had, that you see up there, it began to go and shrink and shrink and shrink until you see that Fertile Crescent area is theirs, but they lost some of the outer boundaries of those. So, all of this happens, and then we see this king named Nebuchadnezzar come to power. Now, keep in mind, many of the kings were named Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It's just like many of the kings were named Caesar and so forth. Just like there's a lot of Joshuas in the world and Stephens in the world. There's a lot of kings named Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar the first, which is not the Nebuchadnezzar of Daniel, but Nebuchadnezzar the first comes to power, and he's in the fourth dynasty of Babylon. And so as this territory had been shrinking and shrinking, really to it's only about, that's the height of it, and then that's the other area, but it keeps this shrinking thing going on, Nebuchadnezzar says enough is enough. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he gets really upset when something happens that would forever change the rest and what is remembered about the Babylonian dynasty. The Elamites finally come and they finally get to the city of Babylon, and they finally ravage the city and they destroy the city, and all of this stuff takes place, and they take a statue of their god Marduk. Now, Marduk is something else. Marduk. They take the statue of Marduk, and whenever they take it home with everything else. And as you know, or maybe you know, in ancient civilizations, whenever they would defeat something, they would take all of its precious things, including their gods. And then this changed over whenever you get to the Roman Empire and stuff, they would deface the gods and all of that stuff. But now they would take the god Marduk, and they took it out of the temple, and they stole him. But Nebuchadnezzar the first wasn't happy about this, and after a little while, he was able to successfully launch a campaign in the middle of summer against them and get back Marduk. So all of this has a foundation we're going towards in a minute. When he gets Marduk back, he takes him back to Babylon. And Marduk is placed back in the rightful temple of Marduk in his rightful place. And back then, they didn't want to make any of the gods upset, so it was always the god who won the victory, even though the god did absolutely nothing to win this victory, right? And so Marduk is taken from being equal, if not subordinate, to some of these other gods, the sun god and the moon god. He becomes the supreme god in the Babylonian mindset. So this rescue was accredited to him. And then we need to understand that this set up a sequence of events in which Nebuchadnezzar I would use this momentum to begin winning back all of this territory that had been lost. So what had shrunk to a little bitty nation, he goes back and he utilizes this to say Marduk is on our side, essentially, and he begins campaigning. Excuse me one moment. When the king campaigns, as you know, it's like when our president campaigns and goes into war. He never actually goes into war, right? He sends others into war for him. And so Nebuchadnezzar the first would go in and would start pursuing these other nations. So over the years, Assyria would besiege Babylon and would finally attempt a partnership with Egypt. So time spans, and they're trying to do all of this battling with other nations in Babylon. And so now, over time, now the Assyrians are trying to make a pact with the Egyptians so that they can come and take them. Because they did not at first see Babylon as the threat to them. Remember, the kingdom's expanding now under Nebuchadnezzar I. And so as the kingdom's expanding, they see, first of all, the Egyptians being the threat. But then as they see this happening, they say, wait a minute, we need to align ourselves with Babylon. Anyway, we see all of this changing of sides. Josiah attempted to block the path, by the way, of the Pharaoh who was heading north to assist the Assyrian army near Carchemish on the northwest bend of the Euphrates. However, Josiah lost his life in the attempt to block this. And we see that in 2 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 35. His involvement impaired the Egyptians and contributed to the Babylonian victory. Now, this took place under the command of a general, if you will. Nabopolassar is how I'm going to say his name. But due to old age or illness, he began leaving the command of the Babylonian army to a crown prince named Nebuchadnezzar II. This is where a whole bunch of biblical history starts coming into contact with Babylon. Not to mention, by the way, all the armies going back and forth between each other and all this stuff happening around Judah. But I say all of that to say this is the setting that brings Nebuchadnezzar II into Judah to conquer Jerusalem. Because all of this expansion of the kingdom is going on. All of this back and forth between people is going on, and it doesn't stop there. Changing sides and so forth. And Judah's smack dab in the middle of the roadways to each of the nations. And so all of this takes place. Nebuchadnezzar I is going, and then this general, if you will, this guy in charge of the army, he begins handing it off. And so Nebuchadnezzar II, and let me get to his picture. Here's his picture. This is a statue of him. This would be an artist rendition of what they think the golden statue that he raised of himself was, that everyone was commanded to worship. And so we see that the young general led his forces in an impressive and decisive victory against the Egyptians at Carchemish in the spring of 605, according to Jeremiah chapter 46. So what on earth does this have to do with Judah? As Nebuchadnezzar II pursued the Egyptians back towards Egypt, what route did he have to take? Through Palestine, through Judah, right? Through that area. And so what he does is he's taking them back through the Syria-Palestinian area. And in mid-August, the commander died in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar then raced and claimed a throne in less than a month, because now what we had missed in history that I don't have on your paper is the commander and the king is now gone at this point. So Nebuchadnezzar II races back, and it's said within a month he secures the kingship. And then he looks at Syria, Palestinian area, and he says, we need to get this back too. And so because of a lot of different things, first it starts with these small raids of Judah. These small little brief raids where they would come in and they would take over, they'd siege Palestine. And these small raids would last about 17 months total. And it was during these raids that he would besiege Jerusalem and capture Daniel and his friends, which we see in Daniel chapter 1, Jeremiah chapter 46. Because the Medes were going after the land to the north and the east, Nebuchadnezzar II was free to concentrate on the Euphrates Valley in Syria, Palestine, as far as Egypt. Once again, after many years of falling apart, Babylon is now repositioned itself as the leading world power under the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar I, and now it reaches its height once again under Nebuchadnezzar II, who takes Daniel and his friends back. So what's interesting about this, and I'm getting ahead of my notes, but that's okay because we're going to skip over to more cultural, religious stuff, things like that. But to paint the picture of what's going on, after Nebuchadnezzar II dies, Babylon falls apart horribly again, only to be overtaken by another empire shortly after. But we do see that Nebuchadnezzar II had a reason to boast in his eyes, right? We see God humble Nebuchadnezzar II in Daniel 4, verse 30. We see the pride of him. But why did he have pride? Because he conquered and reconquered the world and was now king of the world power at that time, greater than Egypt at this point. Unfortunately, he did not understand the destruction that was going to come of his short-lived, if you will, nation. We see under his reign some rebellion and resistance take place. We know of these in Scripture. There's several in Scripture talked about, one of which is Jehoiakim, right? Do we remember Jehoiakim and his rebellion and so forth? After a battle with the Egyptians, in which both sides suffered great losses, Jehoiakim of Judah suddenly switched allegiances away from Babylon, assuming Egypt was now the stronger of the two world powers. You see, this is just retracing history of what happened earlier on with a different nation. And this was to Jeremiah's dismay, according to Jeremiah 27. Nebuchadnezzar personally led the Babylonian forces to Judah. Jehoiakim died before the siege of Jerusalem, leaving Jehoiachin on the throne, and the city fell on March 16th, 597. We have the exact date written in Babylonian history. Isn't that interesting? We have the date. I think it's awesome because I'm sorry, I started coughing today. I don't know if that's allergies or what, but we have so many things in the Old Testament we can't put definite dates to. But we have this recorded in stone, if you will, with the Babylonian records found in the Babylonian Chronicle, reflecting the strategic importance Jerusalem held at this time, and also discuss why this was an amazing move, if you will, in Babylon, because they always praise themselves, just like every nation praises itself for what it does. So we see Jehoiakim / Jehoiachin's rebellion. Who else rebelled? Do you remember in Scripture? Who? Jonah. Okay, who else rebelled against Babylon? I guess that technically is great, huh? Jonah rebelled. He didn't want anyone to come to Christ. He also didn't want to do what he didn't want to do what God said. Anyone remember a word that starts with a Z? Who's right after Jehoiachin, essentially? Zedekiah, right? Zedekiah's rebellion. After Nebuchadnezzar suppressed an insurgent attempt in Babylon, Zedekiah led Judah to align with Egypt. Once again, Nebuchadnezzar's response was fierce and quick, but much worse than the previous response. He laid siege to Jerusalem according to 2 Kings 25, Jeremiah 39, and Ezekiel 24. Jerusalem fell in what seemed to be about a 2.5-year period of attacks. It is said that the general, I can't pronounce his name, but the general leading this group of warriors from Babylon, it is said he so thoroughly destroyed the city that the trauma left a lasting legacy in the psyche of the Jewish people that would resonate for centuries later. Archaeology suggests that in this time frame, Judah's population fell from what they suspect to be 250,000 in the 8th century to only half of that. Judah apparently attempted independence one more time. They didn't learn their lesson. One more time, a little bit later, they attempted it once more, but this was easily squelched by the commander, and we see that in Jeremiah. So all of this war, all of this chaos, you start realizing, okay, this is why Israel's so afraid of people taking them over, right? because everybody around Judah, everyone around Palestine is taking land from other people. They're all warring with each other. And you've got this little section of land that God says, trust in me, and they refuse to trust in him, so they keep getting taken away. And then when they try to rebel, they're not rebelling with God, if you will. And so the rebellions are squelched to the point that Jerusalem is completely destroyed and ransacked. And it leaves it in devastation. And after 43 years of ruling, Nebuchadnezzar II dies and was succeeded by 3 rulers who were ineffective: his son, his son-in-law, and his son-in-law's son. Each one of them were horrible rulers that destroyed the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire was great and vast by the end of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign. But whenever he passed away, it was only a matter of time before they were conquered by another nation, because he left rulers who were not strong behind. By the way, that's not on your take-home lessons we can learn, but thinking about that, that's something we can learn, right? Not that we want to go out and conquer and create empires, but what are we doing in our succession planning? Are we building strong leaders to replace us? Or are we hoping for the best in whatever we get? So we see all of this, and this is the backdrop of what's going on in Scripture. A lot of people you guys may not enjoy history as much as I do, the stories of war and the people's names you can't read, and I never remember their names anyway for the most part. But this is why there's so much chaos in Scripture. See, a lot of times we want to bring history into Scripture, but we fail to bring Scripture into the overall narrative of history. Does that make sense? We pick and choose, and we can talk about, okay, here's history and this is historical, but we fail to realize that the Bible spreads a huge amount of time, and if we can understand better that timeline of what's going on in between the stories and so forth, we get a better picture of what Scripture is saying and why it's so important that God is writing these things. Knowing all of these things in the history and the wars that took place and the sieges that took place upon Palestine gives us a better understanding of why they lamented for their nation, why they were so devastated at what they heard about Jerusalem, why they were so terrified before these attacks that they would come under attack, and why maybe they switched sides back and forth. Maybe there's more to it. Maybe it's they're scared for their life. You see, right now in the United States, we can't really relate to this because we don't have the nation above us and below us terrorizing each other, right? We're not stuck in the middle of 2 fighting individuals wondering when is it our turn to get caught in the crossfire. Whereas Palestine has always been caught in the crossfire. Have you ever noticed that in history? They are always caught in the crossfire of whatever happens out in the Middle East, especially in the Bible times. And so we see this taking place, but it didn't keep God from getting God's agenda done. So I want to move on from Nebuchadnezzar and from the history part and talk more about the city and things that we learn and we've gained and benefited from Babylon. The city of Babylon and its modern ruins, I have this in your notes because I thought this was amazing. This is the city only, and for an ancient city this old, this is amazing. It spreads over 2,000 acres, becoming the largest Mesopotamian city in ancient history. That is huge for this era. Huge. We've all heard about the wonderful things, what is they called? The hanging gardens? Is that what they were called in Babylon? The beautiful gardens that were up on the roofs of the palace. And we hear all these things that we don't see. Obviously, they didn't have cameras to take pictures of, but this was not just a huge, vast city. This was a wealthy city. It was an amazing city, and it was an incredibly ungodly city. Its magnificent walls were entered by 8 gates, each gate named after a god. One of those gates is called the Ishtar Gate, and you've probably seen this. Ishtar was one of the gods that they carried over from the Sumerian religion, and I forget what the Sumerian name. It's Inanna. I think that's the right one. If you add an extra N, it's a different god, so I don't know which one. It's one of the two. But they carry it over. And you see how beautiful and magnificent this was. You see that they made it intricate, and it said that it had huge walls on both sides as you entered towards these gates. And I almost put up some pictures of what they think it would have looked like, but then I thought, well, we don't know, so it's kind of pointless. But there were these huge walls, and it'd be just huge, massive gate after gate after gate of these things. And the walls were huge as well. The surface of the entrance was covered with blue enameled bricks, serving as a background for red and white dragons, symbolic of Marduk, and bulls, symbolic of Adad. So I know this is really hard to see, but that would be a bull. That would be a dragon. Bull, dragon, bull, dragon. Make sense? They all look the same to me, right? But the dragons have the longer necks, and we'll see that in... Actually, I've got a picture right here. See, the dragon has these longer necks and then the weird things, and I had a different picture of one, I thought. So we see this take place. The gate was approached by a street that was 65 feet wide and was paved with white limestone. Bordering the street were walls that were found still standing today as 40 feet high and are decorated with lions 6 feet in length, symbolic of the god Ishtar. Could you imagine walking into a city with all of the entrances looking this awesome? This is what it looks like today, thousands of years later. Imagine what it looked like then. This is just so interesting. I like this stuff. I like pictures. See, I have a picture Bible. No, I'm joking. But we see the city is not just huge. The city is wealthy. The city made a statement. Don't mess with us. The city said, do not mess with us. We have every god on our side. We have every powerful god on our side. Don't mess with Babylon. And that became the representation for the entire nation. The Babylonian nation. Babylon gave us other things too. If you look at your notes, they gave us science. Science wasn't really practiced this much, but we look at what would be early sciences, mathematics, coming more into play now. The Sumerians kind of started that trend, and the Babylonians perfected it in some ways. We see them making significant advances, not only in mathematics, but astronomy. As we will see throughout our study, science was connected to religion for centuries. It is only recent that the two have been disconnected. I hope we've understood that. It's only recent and that science was not hand in hand with religion. And it came about kind of right at the beginning of modernity, that modern era, whenever they wanted. By the way, it's only recent that government and religion was separated. Now, there's benefits to that, right? Whenever it's not a Christian religion, it's great that government and religion is not hand in hand. But we do see that these things are hand in hand, and they bring astronomy and astrology to the table. They got to where they could predict patterns, and they could come up with these great ways of telling what time of year it is. They came up with calendars that were almost exact, almost being the key word, that the Jewish culture would later adapt the calendar of. And we'd see all of these things that they would come up with that we don't see stuff like this up until the Renaissance again, in some ways. Some of it, in fact, gets lost until the Renaissance era comes back up and we start finding these things and learning these things and trying new things that we think hasn't been tried before. They use the decimal system, an indifferent system employing the powers of 60. Eventually, the system they use employing the power of 60 comes down to us. And we use it too, right? 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. 360, which is what? It's a lot of 60s, yeah, but a full circle, right? So we use those measures of 60s as well. And these originated with the Babylonians, and over the years it got perfected, but they got real close when they did it. They observed astronomy, or the stars and the moon and the sun and the alignment, and they recorded these things. The early observations of these were recorded for divining what the gods wanted and what the gods were doing in their mind. But they also used it to tell time and so forth. By a latter period, we see accuracy in astronomy and its observation with advanced mathematics. We see them putting together a lunar solar calendar that was predictable and based on more than only observation, which I already had said the Jewish people would later adopt. I feel like I'm missing something. Yeah. And we see with them, as they look at science, they didn't have everything right, because as they look, this is kind of what they thought the world was. Have you guys ever researched kind of what the Jewish thought of the world was and what the other cultures thought the world was early on? You know, this idea of the world isn't flat. We think, well, that's something that we found out whenever they started going on boats, and all of a sudden they're not falling off the edge of the world. But here, I thought this was interesting. They were talking about this all the way back in the Babylonian period. This is how the Babylonians viewed it. See, you've got the waters above here. You've got what they would call windows of heaven, the sights that you can see down. You've got underneath those the stars, and then the circuit of the sun and the moon here, right? And then this is what I thought was cool. All the mountains that they saw. They believed those mountains held the sky up in place. Isn't that cool? And there's variations of this, by the way. Sheol right here, this is... That's something different. Anyway, they would call it the underworld. And then you've got the pillars of the earth here. And you see sometimes, is it Atlas that was the god that would hold the world up, and whatever mythology that was, Greek mythology, I think. And so you see all these, I'm fascinated by how people viewed the world. And it tells me that we're going to have some things wrong eventually too, even with our modern technology. And so I think the world is round. Maybe it's square though. No, I'm joking. If you find those right angles, let me know. So then we get to the religion. When we talk about the Babylonian religion, we're going to skip over some stuff because the Sumerians had very similar things in some ways. A lot of the gods and a lot of the stories and the epics and the myths were carried over from the Sumerian culture. The Babylonians pretty much worshipped the Sumerians. They thought they were the next best thing in the world. And so they adopted much of what they found when they took over this area. The immediate cultural surroundings of the Old Testament Israelites was influenced by the culture and the religion and religious practices of the Babylonians. They were, I already said, they were infatuated with the Sumerian culture. Once again, they retrieved the stories of people like Gilgamesh. We talked about that last week, about this conqueror and so forth. Once again, we see the story of a massive flood pop up and recorded in Babylonian writing. Once again, we see other similar stories pop up that were recorded in Babylonian writing that are similar to that of the Old Testament. We talked about a lot of those last week, but I want to add a new one this week. In Babylon, or in Babylonian religion, they talked about what we would call, or one author calls, a poetic form of what we would call Job, the book of Job. They have a story of a righteous sufferer, and it's written in poetic fashion. And the story is very similar in some ways to our story of Job. In the story, the sufferer was abandoned by the gods. Now keep in mind I said similar, it's not the same as ours, so bear with me as I tell you the story. This guy was abandoned by the gods, opposed by the king, victimized by others, and afflicted with diseases. He was rejected as a social outcast by all who came into contact with him. After having no relief from all of these things, the sufferer discovers the source of his trouble. It was not the king or others who were responsible, but Marduk, the god himself. The hero, if you will, the sufferer, he's a hero because he withstands all of this. The hero learns through dreams that Marduk's wrath has been appeased, and his fortunes eventually come back and are given to him again. Now, It leaves out a whole bunch of stuff. We're asking, because to me, I read this, and I know that's a summary, but if you read the story, you're kind of like, how does the God get appeased? See, they didn't record that. Probably because, okay, in the view of how they view gods, it's probably, well, I suffered all this, so now the God's happy that I suffered, so now I get this stuff back. But here's the interesting thing to me. While this does not compare to the spiritual insight, the grandeur, and the amazingness of the book of Job that we have in Scripture, the similarities tell us Job is not a story that is made up out of thin air. Remember what I've been saying? A lot of our stories that people look at and they say, well, this is the only place this story is said. It's said in other areas of history. It's just not the exact same details, but it's the same concepts of the stories. Instead of one God, it's gods. Instead of its appeasement, or instead of it being God saying, who do you think you are? It's appeasement. And so the God says, okay, I'll give you stuff back because I'm happy you suffered. I think Job is a historical figure because Babylon's not the only place outside of Scripture that we see a Job-like figure discussed. And you know what? Job is considered to be one of the oldest stories in Scripture outside of Genesis 1 through 6. Maybe even before the flood. Job is considered to be one of the oldest stories in Scripture. And so we see that if Job was one of the oldest stories in Scripture, he had an impact that not only Babylon and the Jewish Bible records it, but other ancient civilizations tell the same story. It's always one man who is righteous, that suffers, that eventually receives back what was taken away. So we see, and there's other similarities too, but I didn't want to bore you with the entire story of it. But then we see that they had various gods. They were polytheistic. They believed in a ton of gods. Tons of gods, actually, by the end of the Babylonian Empire. Many of these gods were carried over from the Sumerian religious beliefs, their deities. So this is where I really want to get. Here's what I hope that we will get out of the remainder of this class, which we are almost done, guys. Our God is not like any other God. Because listen, especially the Babylonians. We're going to talk about the Babylonian gods. Here's about their gods. The gods of their deities were sexual beings who married, raised families, and were subject to injury and even death. The gods of those who lived in the ancient Near East were viewed as having all the same qualities, good and bad, as humans, but without as many limitations as humans have. They were not better than people, they were simply stronger than people. Hence you get Hercules and these demigods and so forth over time. Humankind was seen, this is pretty pessimistic here. Humankind was seen as being created to relieve the gods from the burden of physical labor and to perform ritual service to the gods. These rituals were prescribed by the gods themselves depending upon what they desired. The king was perceived as the official representative of the god of the city, and it was his responsibility to ensure the fertility of the land through the careful observance of the New Year's rituals. Personal misfortune was considered to be the result of offending one or all of the gods, even if the offense was committed unknowingly. This ancient Near Eastern concept of the gods carried over into the Old Testament, even in the book of Job. And we see God fighting this view of him, of how he would be, because they lived in a culture that believed gods were like this. God fights this view in the Old Testament. I would argue he fights this view today. We may see it a little different, but how many times do we think God is that vengeful God that cares nothing about his creation? He just wants to have fun and party. That's how some people see him. By the way, I wrote here a note that they did not see the gods as being unjust. They just weren't forthcoming about their expectations, and they would let humans fall and then force them to repair the relationship. As the gods do their best to administer justice, they are imperfect in their judgment, just as humans are. Now, hopefully we know that is not our God. Our God is much different from that. Hopefully we know with idols, you know what the problem with idols were? It wasn't the fact that it was a man-made thing. What they believed about the idol was that the God would come and it would dwell within that idol. And therefore God would not allow his people to make idols, because when you make an idol, you're believing in this ancient culture that the God would come and fill that idol. And that's why when you get to the ziggurat temples and so forth, you would have these idols and you would have the resting place as the God descended to take up its place in that idol. They would have even a resting place at the top of the ziggurat. Oh, I have a picture of this. This is the one at Ur. Well, maybe. Okay. I'm going to turn it off and back on. Thank you, Donald. It should be the next slide. Donald will get up there in a minute. But this is the ziggurat at Ur, and it was believed that they were filled in. It's not the same as a pyramid. Pyramid's hollow inside. This is filled in. But they would believe that the God would come down, who would rest at the top. There would be a bed and stuff at the top. Here we go. See, this is what we have, the remains of one right here. These are the remains of one at Ur. But this is what they believe it would have looked like. Because there would be this up here which would house a bed and food and so forth for the God. And then the temple section would actually be somewhere lower. Normally it's on the ground level. That's where they would serve the God. And then down the road in history it kind of moves up a little bit in that. But it's important. There's a huge difference between leaving the ziggurat behind. There's a huge difference between their temples and our temple, or the temple of God in the Old Testament. Their temples in the Holy of Holies had an idol. Ours had nothing. Theirs had this man-made thing that their God would fill and they would speak through and they would eat through and all these other things, this man-made thing. Our God simply said, make me a chair to sit on. Right? There was no idol that the God fills up. So there's hopefully differences we're seeing here. And then finally, what can we learn from this? And we're going to end on this because it's time. I believe these 4 things we can learn. Our God is vastly different from the other so-called gods. Scripture finds support through external sources in ancient Babylon, such as Job, the Great Flood, and other stories. Creation, if you will. The Bible records more than just religion. It records historical events. People who say the Bible is just another religious book are wrong. It records historical events that can be found in non-biblical historical record. And the biblical events did not take place. I think this is one of the more important ones. Biblical events did not take place in a vacuum, but were played out on the greater stage of history. We talk about how does history relate to Scripture, but we often neglect to take the Bible and look at it in the scheme of history and get the larger picture of what's going on that impacts the people of God. And because it impacts the people of God, God chooses to act. Does that make sense? I know I ran through this quickly. Babylon, there's so much to go through. I think I skipped something in your notes, but you can read it. That's why I put it there. I knew I'd have to skip some stuff. Thank y'all. Have a wonderful weekend. And be inviting people to a Christmas service.